My name's Elias Cobb, though around Red Bluff folks just call me that soldier fella. Most don't remember which side I fought on, and I never cared much to remind them. Truth is, when the war ended, so did most of the parts of me that knew how to talk easy. I came back with nothing but scars, a stiff shoulder that never healed right, and a hunger for silence. Maybe that's why I ended up out here, on this narrow strip of land that won't grow much more than scrub and stubborn weeds. I've lived 12 years on this patch. It ain't much to look at. The barn leans like a tired mule, half the roof sagging in from storms that tore through years back. The mule itself is older than some of the trees, no good for plowing, barely good for hauling a bucket of feed. A few chickens scratch the dirt yard, tough old hens that don't quit, even when coyotes circle at night. My cabin stands small, boards patched with whatever scrap I could find. Crooked, weather-beaten, but it holds against the wind, and most days that's all I need. I wake before the sun without thinking about it anymore. Coffee on the stove, thick and bitter. Feed the mule, scatter grain for the hens. After that, it's fixing whatever the wind broke loose, chopping wood, mending fence, waiting for the day to end so I can sit by the stove and listen to nothing. That's how it's been. No wife, no children, no neighbors stopping by. Sometimes I tell myself I prefer it that way, but other times I wonder if I just forgot how to live different. You spend enough years alone, you start wearing silence like a coat. It gets heavy, but it keeps you warm in its own way. I didn't plan it like that. After the war, I worked the railroads, then freight, moving heavy loads for men who didn't bother to learn my name. One day I just stopped moving. I bought this land because it was cheap and forgotten, and maybe I felt the same. Out here, no one asks questions. Out here, you can let yourself fade if that's what you want. I tell myself I'm done with people, but truth is, I still catch myself watching the road. There's a track that cuts across the ridge a mile off, and every now and then I'll see a wagon heading toward Red Bluff, or riders making their way west. I stand by the fence, leaning on the post, pretending I don't care, but my chest feels heavy until they're gone from sight. That's the thing no one tells you about loneliness. It don't hurt all at once. It seeps in, slow, like water, through the floorboards, until one day you realize the silence is louder than any gunfire you ever heard. Sometimes, when the wind dies down, I hear myself breathing, and it feels like the only sound left in the world. I try not to think about the cabin at night, how empty it gets when the fire burns low. I don't keep pictures out. Used to have one, my brother Daniel in his blue coat before the war took him, but the sun faded his face until he looked like a ghost on paper. I tucked it behind the stove years ago. Couldn't bring myself to burn it. Couldn't bring myself to look at it either. Still, I get by. A man learns to fix what's broken, even if it's just boards and hinges. A man learns to tend what'll stay alive, even if it's just chickens. And if that's all my life amounts to, well, I figured that was enough. But the truth is, sometimes at night, when the coyotes yip out by the ridge, I feel the weight of that chair across from mine by the fire. Empty all these years, and I wonder if a man can get too used to being alone. I'd told myself no one was coming. No one needed to. But I didn't know then what was waiting just past the fence line. I didn't know a small pair of bare feet would walk my way and change everything I thought I knew about keeping to myself. Before I tell you what happened, before I tell you about the girl and her mother and how they turned this broken down place into something I didn't think I'd ever have again, I want to ask you something. If you're listening, if you're here with me now, don't forget to like this video, leave me a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Tell me where you're watching from. Maybe you're in a big city where the nights never get quiet, or maybe you're somewhere like Red Bluff, where the land itself feels like it remembers more than people do. Either way, I'd be glad to know you're out there, because this story, it ain't just mine anymore. It belongs to the little girl who showed up at my fence line starving, and the mother who followed her days later with bruises on her ribs and pride still burning in her eyes. It belongs to the nights we spent listening for footsteps outside, and the mornings when the fire felt warmer because they were still there when the sun came up. It belongs to what happens when a man who thought he was finished finds out life still has more for him, even when he swore it didn't. So settle in, take a breath, and let me carry you back to that first day. The day I was splitting kindling on the porch, thinking nothing ever changes out here, and then I looked up and saw her standing there. I remember the first time I saw her like it was yesterday. even though I've tried 100 times to tell myself it was just another afternoon, nothing out of the ordinary. The truth is, it was the kind of moment that cuts a man's life in two, what came before and what came after. I was out front with the hatchet in my hands, splitting kindling like I'd done 1,000 times before, sweat running down my back even though the wind had cooled some. My shoulder ached, same place it always did when the swing of the blade pulled it wrong, and I told myself to keep going just a little longer before calling it for the day. That's when I felt it, not a sound, but the kind of silence that don't feel natural, the kind that makes the hairs on your arms lift. It wasn't the quiet of wind dying down or birds roosting. Early. It was heavy, watchful, like someone was holding their breath at the edge of my world. I stopped mid-swing, the hatchet hanging loose in my hand. I turned my head slow, careful, not wanting to startle whatever it was I knew I'd find. And there she was, small, barefoot, standing just inside the fence line like she'd been carved from the dust itself. Couldn't have been more than 7 years old, skinny as a rail, knees scabbed and dark, hair tangled so bad it looked like it had grown right into the dirt she'd walked through. Her dress, if you could call it that, hung off her like a rag a woman might use to wipe her hands. She had her arms wrapped tight around her belly, and those eyes, big, unblinking, staring straight at me like she'd already decided what kind of man I was. I didn't move toward her. I just stood there, letting the handle of the hatchet rest against my leg, my throat dry in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. I ain't good with children, never was. I never had any of my own, and the war left me with little patience for what I didn't understand. But looking at her, I couldn't bring myself to feel the distance I usually carried. What I felt instead was something harder to put a name to, a weight in my chest, sharp and steady, like a reminder of every time I'd seen hunger carve a body down to bone. "You lost?" I asked finally, my voice low, careful not to carry too far. She didn't answer, just kept staring, still as a fence post. I rubbed a hand over my beard, tried again. "You hungry?" Nothing, not a nod, not a word, just those eyes watching me like I was the one being measured. And maybe I was. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was the way she didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't move at all. Maybe it was the way I saw more silence in her than even I carried, and it scared me. Whatever it was, I turned slow, set the hatchet down, and walked up the porch steps. I didn't look back to see if she'd follow. I left the door open behind me, the kind of invitation I'd never given another soul in all my years out here. Inside, I cut a thick piece of cornbread, wrapped it in an old rag, and carried it back outside. She hadn't moved. I set it down on the porch railing, then sat on the top step, my hands loose on my knees, eyes fixed on the dirt in front of me. I figured if she wanted it, she'd take it. If not, then nothing lost. Minutes passed, long enough that I almost convinced myself she wasn't coming closer. Then I heard her feet, scraping soft against the dry earth. She moved slow, cautious, like an animal that had been chased too many times. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, eyes flicking from me to the bread and back again. She didn't reach for it right away, just studied it, like she needed to make sure it wasn't a trick. When she finally took it, she used both hands, clutching it so tight I thought it might crumble before she ever tasted it. The way she ate near broke. Me. Not wild, not greedy, just slow, careful bites, like her body wasn't used to having food and didn't trust it to stay. She chewed each mouthful like it might be her last, her small shoulders shaking every so often, though she never looked up. I sat there in silence, watching, and for the first time in years, I felt the kind of ache that wasn't born of war or old wounds. It was something deeper, the kind a man don't have words for. When she finished, I stood, went back inside, and fetched a blanket. It wasn't much, just an old thing patched up more times than I could count, but it was clean and warm. I walked back out and held it toward her. She froze, wary as ever, before stepping up and taking it in both hands. She didn't say thank you, and I didn't need her to. The way she clutched it to her chest was thanks enough. I nodded toward the porch corner, the spot tucked behind a rain barrel where the wind couldn't reach. She understood without words, curled herself there with the blanket wrapped tight around her, eyes still open, still watching. I didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she came from, didn't ask who she'd left behind. I figured if she wanted to be gone in the morning, she would be. And if she stayed, well, I'd figure that out then. That night I sat inside by the stove, boots still on, gun nearby, every sound from outside running sharp through me. I told myself I wasn't worried, just cautious. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about her, about how small she looked curled against the wall, about the way she ate that bread like she'd forgotten what food was, about how a child could hold herself so still, so silent, like the world had already taught her not to expect mercy. I didn't sleep much, not really. And when dawn broke and I stepped outside, she was gone. The blanket folded neat on the step, like she'd never been there at all. I stood a long time staring at that folded cloth, the kind of silence pressing on me that I'd never felt before. I told myself it was over, just a strange visit from a starving girl passing through, but deep down I knew better. I knew I'd be listening for those footsteps again, waiting without admitting it, because a man don't forget the look in eyes like hers, not ever. It was 3 days after the girl vanished that I saw her again. I'd half convinced myself she'd only been some passing shadow, a starving child blown in by the wind and carried out just as quick. Still, I'd kept the blanket folded neat by the door, like I couldn't bring myself to tuck it away. Some part of me was waiting, though I wouldn't have admitted it even to myself. That evening, I was scattering feed near the chicken coop when the mule started snorting, ears twitching toward the ridge. Animals don't make noise for no reason. I wiped my hands on my trousers, shaded my eyes against the setting sun, and looked up. That's when I saw them. 2 figures this time. The girl, same dirt-streaked dress, same stubborn eyes, and beside her a woman moving slow, one hand resting on the child's shoulder. I straightened, heart thudding against my ribs in a way it hadn't for years. The girl, Lahi, I'd come to know her name later, looked the same as before, small and thin but steady on her feet, like she'd drawn her strength from somewhere I couldn't see. The woman was different. She was taller, shoulders narrow under clothes that hung loose, blonde hair pulled back rough, face drawn with hollows where there should have been softness. But it was her eyes that caught me, sharp, alert, tired to the bone, but refusing to bow. She carried herself like someone used to being told no and already bracing to hear it again. I stood still, waiting for her to speak first. She did. "We ain't looking for charity," she said, her voice even, not begging, not breaking, just somewhere we can stop running. Her words hit me like a stone dropped in a well. I didn't answer right away. I looked at her, at the bruises half hidden beneath her collar, at the way her fingers twitched just slightly when the wind shifted, like she was always ready to pull the girl close. I thought about the porch, the blanket, the empty cabin behind me. My throat worked, but no words came out. Instead, I turned, walked to the cabin door, and pushed it open wide. I didn't say a thing, just left it open. That was answer enough. She hesitated a moment, then stepped inside, the girl tight to her side. The first thing she did was breathe deep, though she tried to hide it. I could see the way her shoulders dropped when the warmth hit her, the way her eyes flicked over the room, like she couldn't quite believe it was safe to stand still. The girl clung close, but she wasn't scared, just watchful, like she was already memorizing the place in case they had to run again. I stayed by the stove, shifting the pot that had been simmering low since morning. I didn't ask questions, I didn't ask names. I just set out 3 bowls. They sat at the table, the woman stiff in her chair, the girl perched on the edge with her feet swinging above the floor. The food was simple, beans, bread hard enough to break a tooth, and coffee boiled too long, but they ate like it was a feast. The girl tried to hide how hungry she was, sneaking quick bites like she didn't want me to notice, and it near broke me to see it. The woman ate slower, eyes on the door every few minutes, jaw tight as if she expected someone to come crashing through. When the bowls were empty, I stood and began clearing them. But she rose quick, almost like it was reflex, and reached for the dishes. I let her. She scrubbed them at the basin, sleeves rolled, hands red from the cold water. For a moment, watching her, it felt almost normal, like the kind of evening I used to have long ago, when someone else's hands worked beside mine, when silence didn't feel so sharp. She hummed under her breath, without meaning to, and the sound stopped me short. She cut it off quick, embarrassed, but it lingered in the air like smoke. There were only 2 places to sleep, my narrow cot near the fire and a pile of quilts I spread out on the floor by the stove. I pulled another blanket from the trunk, laid it out without a word. The girl's eyes lit up when she saw it, not because it was soft or fine, but because it meant she wouldn't have to curl up outside. She wrapped herself in it, like she'd been waiting for that moment all her life. As the fire settled into coals, the woman spoke again, her voice low. "You got a wife?" I shook my head. "Kids?" "No." She didn't press, just nodded, then pulled the girl into her side. They sat that way for a while, saying nothing. The child rested her head on her mother's shoulder, eyelids heavy, safe enough at last to drift. I sat in my chair, watching the flames shift, not daring to let my eyes linger on them too long. I didn't ask where they'd come from, but the pieces spoke plain enough. The bruises on her skin, the way she walked like her back ached in places that had been struck too often, the silence between her and her daughter, filled with the kind of knowing only the hurt can carry. I thought about the folded blanket left on my porch 3 mornings ago. I thought about how she'd eaten, careful and slow, and about the steadiness in her mother's voice even when her hands trembled. Later, after the girl had fallen asleep under the quilt, the woman sat at the edge of her makeshift bed, brushing curls back from her daughter's forehead. I was still by the fire, boots planted, eyes on the coals. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "You sure about this?" "I ain't done anything yet," I said. "You let us in." I stared at the fire, the crackle filling the space between us. She watched me for a moment longer, then nodded like she understood something I hadn't said out loud. She laid down beside her daughter, pulled the blanket over them both, and closed her eyes. I stayed awake long after, the fire low, the cabin quiet, except for their breathing. I thought about how long it had been since anyone had slept under my roof, how I'd told myself I liked the silence but now wasn't sure anymore. The wind pushed against the walls, but inside it was warm, not just from the stove, from something else, something I hadn't felt in a long time. And though I told myself it was just for the night, deep down I already knew it wasn't, not anymore. That first night with them under my roof didn't feel real. I'd sat in that chair by the fire for more years than I cared to count, boots planted on the floor, rifle leaned close, watching flames burn down to coals with no one beside me. I knew every groan of the wood, every crack of the stovepipe, every draft that slipped through the seams of the cabin. But with them there, the room sounded different. It breathed. 2 sets of lungs added to mine, 2 quiet, heartbeats shifting in the silence, and it unsettled me in a way I couldn't name. May, though I didn't know her name yet, had curled herself on the floor near the stove, her daughter tucked tight to her side. The girl, Lahi, was asleep almost before the fire settled, her small hand resting against her mother's chest, like she didn't want to let her go, not even in dreams. May didn't sleep right away. She lay still, one arm around her girl, eyes open, watching the shadows climb the ceiling. I knew because I was watching her too, though I tried not to make it plain. I'd never had a woman under my roof who wasn't kin or neighbor, and never like this, bruised, worn down, carrying more weight than her frame should have been able to hold. I wanted to ask where they'd come from, who had put those marks on her skin, what kind of man drove a child to beg at a stranger's door. The words sat heavy on my tongue, but I kept them back. I've learned that asking too much too soon only makes folks retreat further, and I could see plain enough they'd been running from someone. I figured the less I asked, the longer they'd stay, at least through the night. The fire snapped, throwing sparks behind the grate. May shifted slightly, pulling the blanket higher over the girl's shoulders. She caught me looking, and for the first time our eyes met. She didn't speak, didn't flinch, didn't look away. Just held my gaze long enough for me to feel something in my chest tighten. Then she turned back to her daughter, brushing her curls back gently, her lips moving with words I couldn't hear. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the coals, telling myself not to get involved. It wasn't my burden, wasn't my fight. I'd lived too many years keeping to myself, staying invisible in a town where no one remembered my name unless they needed something fixed. But there they were, 2 lives settled in my cabin, like it was the only safe ground left for them. And for all the years I'd told myself I didn't need anyone, the truth was plain now. I didn't want them to go. Sometime in the night, when the fire had burned low and the cabin smelled of ash and beans, May spoke. Her voice was soft, almost too quiet to reach me. "We come from Baker's Ridge," she said, eyes still on the girl. "Man, there ain't someone we could stay near." That was all she offered. No names, no details, just enough to tell me what I already suspected. I didn't ask more. I just nodded, though I knew she couldn't see it in the dark. My mind worked at the pieces anyway. Baker's Ridge was 40 miles by the river. A woman and child don't walk that far unless they're desperate, unless they're running from something that would rather see them buried than free. The thought sat in me like a stone, heavy and unmoving. Later, long after she'd gone quiet, she sat up slightly, her face lit by the glow of the dying fire. "You sure about this?" she asked. I shifted in my chair. "I ain't done anything yet." "You let us in." I didn't answer, just stared at the coals. I didn't need to tell her what she already knew. She nodded, slow, like she'd been expecting that answer, then lay back down and pulled her daughter close. The hours crawled. I stayed awake, boots still on, rifle close. Every sound outside had me listening sharp. The wind rattling the roof boards, the mule shifting in the lean-to, the chickens rustling in their roost. I kept thinking of footsteps, of doors breaking open, of voices shouting in the dark. I'd lived through enough nights like that to know better than to trust quiet. But inside, with their breathing steady, the silence wasn't heavy the way it usually was. It was full. That's the only way I can put it. Full in a way that reminded me of something I hadn't felt since before the war, when my brother's laughter still filled rooms we shared. By first light, pale streaks cut across the floor through the cracks in the wall. I stood and stretched my back, careful not to wake them. They hadn't stirred all night, and I knew that meant something. Folks on the run don't rest easy unless they've found ground that feels safe. And my cabin, crooked and patched as it was, had given them that. I poured coffee into a tin cup, leaned against the counter, and let myself look at them. May's face in the weak morning light looked softer, less guarded, though the shadows under her eyes still told the truth of too many sleepless nights. The girl was curled tight against her, mouth open slightly, breathing steady, her hand still pressed close like she needed to feel her mother's heartbeat. For a moment, watching them, I forgot about the rifle, about the war, about the long stretch of empty years behind me. For a moment, the cabin didn't feel like just a place to survive. It felt like something more. And I knew, though I told myself it was just for a night, that I wouldn't be able to go back to the way it was before. Not now. Not after hearing the sound of another's breathing in my house. Not after seeing a child sleep safe where once there was nothing but dust and silence. The days that followed didn't fall into place all at once, but little by little, like fence posts sinking into good soil. At first, everything felt temporary. May carried herself as if she might pack up at any moment, eyes glancing toward the door when the wind rattled too hard, voice steady but always measured, like she was bracing for the ground to give out. The girl stayed close, never more than a step away, her small hand often clutching the hem of her mother's dress. Still, even in that tightness, I could see something changing. It was in the way May's shoulders eased when she scrubbed dishes at the basin, or the way the girl lingered at the shelf, staring at that old toy train I hadn't wound in years. One morning, May asked if she could cook. She stood by the stove, sleeves rolled, eyes on the skillet. "I've been cooking since I was 12, she said, her voice carrying that same mixture of pride and apology I'd come to recognize. I nodded toward the pan. "Eggs and beans, ain't much else." "That'll do fine," she said, already reaching for the skillet like she'd lived here longer than 2 days. I watched her move, careful, precise, not wasting space, not asking where things were. She handled each task with the kind of control that only comes from years of keeping herself small, not because she wanted to, but because life had forced her into it. I didn't say any of that out loud. I just leaned against the counter, arms folded, and let the smell of frying eggs settle into the room, a smell I hadn't known in far too long. The girl sat at the table, legs swinging, eyes following every move her mother made. She didn't speak much, but when I pulled the toy train from the shelf, her eyes widened. I set it down, wound it slow, and let it stutter across the table. The little wheels squealed, rattling against the wood. She smiled, just a small thing at first, then let out a laugh, sharp and high, like she hadn't used her voice for joy in a long time. I didn't smile back, not the way most men might. but something inside me tightened, and I knew I'd remember that sound for the rest of my days. Later that morning, May asked about kindling. "I seen dry limbs near the fence line," she said, pulling on my hat without waiting for permission. "Don't like sitting still when I got hands." I almost told her to rest, but the way she stood there, chin lifted just enough to make clear she wasn't asking, made me swallow the words. "There's a basket in the shed," I said instead. She returned an hour later with her arms full, cheeks pink from the wind, hair pulled loose from its tie. She looked younger in that moment, though I knew well enough the years of hurt carved into her would never fully vanish. By the afternoon, she was on the barn roof with a hammer in her hand. "Roof's coming loose at the north end," she told me, like it was nothing. "You patch roofs?" I asked, surprised. "I do what needs doing," she said, driving a nail without hesitation. I didn't argue. We worked side by side, me holding boards steady while she hammered, the two of us moving in rhythm without much talk. I realized then how long it had been since I'd shared labor with anyone. Work had always been my shield against the world. If my hands were busy, no one could ask for more. But standing there with her, it didn't feel like defense. It felt like something shared, something almost steady. The girl watched from the yard, chasing chickens between chores. She moved easier now, laughter bubbling up here and there, not forced, but free. May braided her hair in the evenings, sitting by the fire with quiet patience, fingers weaving careful strands while the girl leaned against her knee. One night, I caught myself staring at them, the way the firelight softened May's face, the way the girl's eyes fluttered half shut as her hair was tied off neat. May noticed, but she didn't look away. She just kept braiding, her hands sure, her face unreadable. Meals felt different, too. At first, they ate like it might be their last supper, cautious and hurried. But slowly, the tension eased. Lahi started holding her spoon steady instead of clutching it like someone might snatch it away. May began humming again, without cutting herself short. The silence at the table changed. It wasn't sharp anymore, wasn't just the sound of chewing and swallowing. It was the silence of belonging, of people who didn't need to fill the air to be understood. At night, when the girl slept, May sometimes stayed awake, stitching clothes by lamplight or boiling soap in the pot out back. She didn't ask me about my past, and I didn't press her about hers. Still, little pieces came out. The bruises spoke loud enough, but so did the way her body tensed at certain sounds, the slam of a door, the distant echo of hooves on the ridge. I didn't need the whole story to know what kind of man she'd left behind. I'd seen enough of that kind of cruelty in the war, in camps, in towns where lawmen wore badges without honor. And yet, despite it all, she kept moving, kept working, kept making space for her daughter to feel safe. That strength settled into me deeper than I expected. I'd thought of women mostly in the way men talk in town, wives, widows, mothers raising young. But May was something else entirely. She was survival made flesh, and it stirred something in me I hadn't felt since long before the war. Each day that passed, the cabin changed. The corners smelled less of dust and more of stew. The windows, once bare, began to catch scraps of fabric she'd found and sewn into curtains. The air inside held the warmth of 3 people living, breathing, sharing space. I hadn't meant for it to happen, but it did. I found myself listening not for the coyotes or the creak of wood, but for the sound of her laugh when the girl said something clever, for the hum she carried under her breath, for the light step of small feet across the floor. One evening, after supper, I stepped outside to smoke, leaning against the porch post with the stars opening wide above me. May joined me after a while, arms crossed against the wind. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "We've been running near 2 years," she said softly. "Every time I think we're safe, something cracks." I didn't say anything. There weren't words for that kind of truth. "I ain't asking to stay forever," she went on, her voice steady but quiet. "But if you'll have us, I'll work. I'll keep the girl fed. You won't regret it." I exhaled smoke into the cold and kept my eyes on the stars. "I don't regret letting you in." She nodded once, then went back inside. I stayed out there a long while, thinking about what it meant to let people close again, about what it might cost, and about whether I had the strength left to do it. But when I finally stepped back into that warm cabin, when I saw the girl curled safe under the quilt and May sitting steady by the fire, I knew the truth already. Whatever the cost, I wasn't sending them away. Not now. Not ever. It was bound to happen, I suppose. Peace never lingers long, not for men like me, not for women like May, not for children who learn too early how to run. I'd been fooling myself, letting the rhythm of chores and suppers and laughter soften me, but the world has a way of reminding you what it really is. That reminder came the first time I rode into town with their faces lingering in my mind. Red Bluff was the kind of place where no one looked too close if you didn't want them to. I'd been invisible there for years, the quiet soldier with a crooked cabin, a man people nodded to but didn't call by name. That afternoon, I hitched the mule by the feed store and stepped into Vernon Talley's shop for the usual: flour, lamp oil, coffee, beans. I set the items on the counter, and Vernon squinted at me over his spectacles. "You stocking up early?" he asked, suspicion curling around his words. I met his eyes, steady as I could. "Just figured I would," I said, handing over coins. He didn't press, just gave a shrug and rang up the total. But as I turned to leave, I saw him. A man leaning against the post out front, coat brown, hat pulled low, boots too clean for trail dust. He wasn't looking at anything in particular, just letting his eyes drift over the street until they landed on me. He didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't move. Just watched. I'd seen men like that before. Men who carried a look like a brand. Predators, hunters, the kind who never needed to raise their voice to make you feel the danger in their silence. My gut tightened the way it used to in camps, the way it did when you knew a shell was about to fall long before you heard it. I walked past him without a word, untied the mule, and rode out. But his eyes followed me, and I felt them burning between my shoulders the whole way home. When I stepped back into the cabin, May was at the basin, sleeves wet, scrubbing with a rhythm that told me she'd been trying to wash more than dishes. Lahi sat at the table with scraps of charcoal, drawing crooked lines on the torn paper. For a moment, the place felt safe again. Then I set the sack of supplies down and spoke. "Didn't like the look of a man outside the store," I said. May froze, just for a second, but it was enough. She didn't turn, didn't ask for details, just kept scrubbing harder. "Tall? Brown vest? Black hat?" "Yeah," I said slowly. She closed her eyes, shoulders sagging under the weight of recognition. "That's one of his brothers." I moved to the window, staring out at the ridge as if I might see him standing there already. "You think he followed you all the way out here?" "I don't know," she whispered, her voice flat but tight. "But if he's sniffing around, it won't take him long." There was no panic in her tone, no pleading, just resignation, the kind that comes when you've been running so long you stop pretending there's an end to it. She set the dish down, dried her hands on her skirt, and finally met my eyes. What I saw there wasn't fear, it was weariness, a deep tiredness that had been carried too many miles. "You trust me to handle it?" I asked. She studied me for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "You let us in. That's more than most would have done. I trust what that means." That night I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch with the rifle laid across my knees, watching the land settle into darkness. May braided Lahi's hair by lamplight inside, her low voice murmuring to the child until she leaned against her and drifted off. Through the window, their shadows played against the wall, fragile but whole. I listened to the wind, to the owls calling from the trees, to the sound of a family breathing steady inside a house that hadn't known such a thing in years. But beneath it all, I listened for something else. Hoofbeats, footsteps, trouble I knew was coming. The next few days carried a weight that never lifted. I went about chores, same as always, feeding stock, chopping wood, patching fence, but my eyes stayed sharp, ears tuned for the smallest shift beyond the ridge. May kept the curtains drawn at night, lamps dimmed sooner than usual. She still cooked, still read to Lahi by the fire, but there was a tightness in her body now, a carefulness in her voice. Lahi, sensing it without knowing why, started staying closer to her mother. She still laughed, still ran with the chickens now and then, but her steps slowed when the wind carried strange sounds, and she slept pressed tight against May, no space left between them. I hated it, hated seeing the way a man's shadow could narrow a child's world back down to fear, hated knowing the scars May carried weren't the kind that faded, but the kind that deepened with every reminder. I cleaned the rifle twice a day, checked the hinges on the doors, walked the perimeter of the land before sundown. I told myself it was just precaution, but I knew better. This wasn't the silence I had lived with all these years. This was the hush before something broke. One morning, while I was tightening a hinge in the shed, May appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, the wind lifting strands of her hair. "If it comes to it," she said calmly, "I can shoot." I looked up at her, surprised less by the words than by the steadiness in her voice. "You ever had to?" "Once," she said. "Didn't hit nothing, but it was loud enough to stop him." I wiped my hands on a rag, gave a slow nod. "There's a 12 gauge under the bed. Ain't fancy, but it'll fire." She didn't thank me. She didn't have to. That evening, as the sun fell and the cold crept in, I stood by the porch again with the rifle laid across my arm. May was inside, braiding Lahi's hair, the child humming a tune I didn't recognize. I kept my eyes on the dark beyond the fence line, on the shadows between the trees, on the place where I knew danger would come, because it always does, and when it does, a man has to decide what he'll stand for and what he won't let be taken. I already knew my answer. The days after I saw that man in Red Bluff took on a kind of silence I hadn't known before. I'd lived with quiet most of my life, the sort of quiet that wraps around you because there's nothing else left. But this was different. This was a waiting kind of silence, stretched thin across every moment, like the land itself was holding its breath. I went about my chores the same as always, feeding the chickens, patching the fence, hauling water, but my eyes were sharper, my ears tuned for sounds that didn't belong. A branch breaking, a hoof hitting hard ground, the shift of a shadow where none should be. May felt it too. She didn't speak of it outright, but I saw it in the way she moved. Her hands worked steady, but her shoulders stayed tight, her eyes flicking toward the windows when dusk settled. She kept the lamps low, curtains drawn before the sun had even gone down, and though her voice stayed calm for Lahi's sake, there was a thinness to it, a thread pulled tight. At night, she lay close to her daughter, arms wrapped firm, as if holding her was the only way to keep the dark from breaking in. Lahi sensed it more than she understood it. She ran less, laughed softer, slept pressed so close to her mother that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Sometimes she'd crawl onto the chair beside me, setting her small hands on my knee, and ask questions she never waited for me to answer. Why do owls hoot at night? Do you think the mule dreams when he sleeps? Her voice was curious, but her eyes searched mine like she was looking for something stronger than answers, something steady enough to hold on to. I gave her what I could, a nod, a hand resting on her hair, the quiet certainty that she was safe as long as she was here. I kept the rifle close, cleaned it every morning, checked the sights every night. The shotgun stayed by the door, loaded. I took to walking the perimeter before bed, boots crunching over frosted ground, breath clouding in the cold. It wasn't that I expected trouble every hour, but I couldn't stand the thought of being caught off guard. I'd survived too many nights in the war by trusting my gut, and my gut told me this wasn't over. One night, while the fire burned low and the girl slept curled under her quilt, May sat at the table stitching. The lamplight threw her face into shadow, but I could see the lines of weariness etched deep. She didn't look up when she spoke. "How long you think we got before he comes?" I set my cup down, the coffee long gone cold. "Could be tomorrow, could be weeks, but he's out there, watching." Her hands paused in their stitching, the needle glinting in the light. She let out a breath, steady but heavy. "I'd rather he come and get it over with." "He will," I said quietly, "and we'll be ready." She nodded once, no questions, no protest, just trust. That was harder on me than the waiting. I'd spent years keeping people out, building my life on the certainty that I only had myself to answer for. And here she was, trusting me with her life and her daughter's, as if I'd been meant to carry such weight all along. The cabin itself seemed to know. The walls groaned with the wind, but it felt different, like even the boards were bracing. The air carried a hush, not empty but taut. The mule grew restless in the lean-to, snorting at nothing I could see. The chickens clucked uneasy after sundown, feathers ruffling at shadows that slipped too close. The land had taken on that old feeling I remembered from the battlefield, the stillness before a storm of noise and fire. May started keeping a small revolver in her coat pocket, one I'd handed her from the trunk. She checked the chamber with a sure hand, no tremble, no second guessing. She never thanked me, and I never asked her to. Some things don't need words. One morning, while we hauled water from the well, she asked, "You ever lose someone close?" "My brother," I answered. "War took him, 2nd year. Couldn't reach him in time." She set the bucket down, hands raw from the cold, and gave a small nod. "I lost my sister. Fever when we were girls. After that, it was just me and our mother for a long while. Then not even that." We didn't say anything more, but the silence that followed wasn't the heavy kind. It was the kind where two people understand each other a little better than they had before. That night, after supper, when the fire was low and the girl was asleep, I sat in my chair by the door, rifle across my knees, boots still on. May watched me from across the table, her stitching set aside. She didn't ask why I stayed ready. She already knew. Instead, she said, "If he comes, I don't want to run anymore." I met her eyes, steady. "Then we won't." She leaned back slowly, arms folded across her chest, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw her body settle into a kind of ease. Not peace, not yet, but something close enough to keep the night from feeling unbearable. I stayed awake long after she lay down beside her daughter, the fire throwing shadows that bent across the walls. My eyes stayed fixed on the door, on the window, on the dark beyond the fence line. And though my body ached with the weight of waiting, my chest carried something stronger than fear, a kind of resolve I hadn't felt since the war. Back then, I fought because I was told to. This time, if the fight came, it would be by choice, because no man with eyes cold as that stranger's was going to step foot in my cabin and take away the only good thing that had walked into my life in years. The morning he came. The air was colder than usual, sharp enough that my breath hung like smoke when I stepped outside. I'd been up all night again, sitting by the door with the rifle across my knees, listening to the stillness. When you've lived long enough with danger, you can feel the moment before it arrives. The land goes quiet, even the chickens keep their beaks shut, and your bones start telling you that something's moving in the dark. It was just past dawn when I heard the sound, boots on frozen ground, slow and deliberate. Not the mule, not May, not a coyote, nosing through the brush. This was a man. I rose from my chair without a word, pushed the door open, and stepped into the cold. The sky was gray, the ridge washed in pale light, and I saw him by the barn. Tall, coat hanging heavy, hat pulled low. A rifle slung casual over his shoulder, like he didn't expect to need it. He turned when he heard me, and the way he started walking toward the cabin told me plain enough this wasn't a visit to trade pleasantries. I met him halfway by the well, ground flat between us, the air so still I could hear each crunch of his boots. He stopped a few paces short, squinting like he was weighing me. "You Elias Cobb?" he asked. "I am." He shifted his rifle strap, the hint of a smirk cutting across his face. "I'm looking for a woman. Name's Melanie, and a girl, about this high." He lifted a hand near his hip, eyes narrowing. "You seen anyone like that?" I let the silence stretch before I answered. My heart was steady, my jaw tight. "You the one she ran from?" That smirk widened just a little. "That, her story, she say that." He leaned in, voice lowering. "I ain't here to argue, just want what's mine." The word burned in my chest, mine, like she was a cow branded for market, like the girl was nothing more than property. I raised the rifle just enough for him to understand it wasn't going to be talk that decided this. "She ain't yours." That hung between us, heavier than the frost. He took a step closer, eyes cold, hand brushing the butt of his pistol. "You think you can play hero out here in the middle of nowhere?" "I ain't playing," I said, my voice flat, carrying more years of war and loss than I cared to remember. "I buried better men than you, and I won't think twice if you take another step." For a second, I thought he might test me. His jaw clenched, his eyes worked over mine, weighing pride against survival. I didn't flinch, I didn't blink. The only thing I gave him was the dead certainty that I meant every word. He spit into the dirt, a bitter sound cutting through the quiet. "She'll run again," he said, his voice laced with venom. "That's what women like her do." I didn't lower the rifle, I didn't even shift my weight. "Then she'll do it with her head high," I told him. Another long moment passed. the kind that stretches time so thin you could break it with a whisper. Then he turned, slow but sure, and walked back to his horse. He mounted without looking at me, tugged the reins, and rode off into the trees. The sound of hooves faded until it was just the wind again, and still I stood there, rifle up, waiting for the land to tell me it was done. When I finally lowered the gun, the cold had already crept into my bones. I turned toward the cabin, my breath ragged, even though I hadn't moved more than a few steps. My hands were steady, but inside, something else was shaking. Not fear, not relief, but the heavy truth of what I'd just done. Not the standoff itself, but the choice behind it. I hadn't stood for myself. I hadn't even stood for pride. I'd stood for them. When I opened the door, May was crouched low by the stove, one arm wrapped around Lahi, who clung to her dress with wide, frightened eyes. May looked up, her face pale, lips tight. "He gone?" she asked. I nodded once. "For good." I didn't answer right away, but May let out a breath anyway, the kind of breath you don't know you've been holding for years. Lahi looked from her mother to me, her voice small but sharp. "You didn't shoot him." I knelt down so we were eye to eye. "Didn't need to." She studied me with those steady little eyes, and I swear in that moment I felt her measuring me the same way she had the first time she stood barefoot at my fence. She nodded, then curled back against her mother's side, her small hands gripping tighter than before. The rest of that day moved slower, like the air itself was heavier. May left the curtains open for the first time in weeks. She washed her hair and hung it out to dry in the cold air, and when the wind picked up, she didn't rush to pull it back inside. Lahi helped me with the chickens again, her laugh coming easier, her steps lighter, though her eyes still carried the memory of fear. That night, we sat on the porch together, all three of us, the stars spread wide above. No words, just the sound of the land breathing again, the creak of the boards beneath us, the owl calling from the ridge. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to keep the rifle at my side. I kept it close, sure enough, but I didn't hold it like a lifeline. I held the moment instead, the weight of what had passed, and the truth of what I knew now. This cabin, this land, this life, it wasn't mine alone anymore. And when I finally went inside, closing the door behind us, it wasn't fear that kept me awake that night. It was the realization that for the first time in years, I had something worth protecting, and I would not let it be taken. After he rode off, the land felt different. For weeks it had carried that heavy kind of stillness, the kind that makes you hold your breath without knowing it. But once his shadow was gone, something in the air eased. It wasn't sudden, not like the lifting of a storm, but slow, like thaw seeping into the ground after a hard freeze. I noticed it first in May. She kept the curtains drawn so long I thought she'd forgotten what daylight looked like, but the day after he left, she pulled them wide. The cabin filled with light that had been kept out too long, dust catching in golden beams across the floor. She stood there with the sun on her face, hair damp from washing, eyes half closed like she'd been starving for warmth. I didn't say a word, just sat in my chair, watching her breathe in peace, like it was something she thought she'd never see again. Lahi was different too. She had carried the fear quiet, the way children do, storing it in the slump of her shoulders, in the way her eyes flicked to the door each time the wind knocked. But now she started to hum while she worked, soft at first, then louder when she thought no one was listening. She chased the hens again, giggling when they scattered, and she sat on the porch with a scrap of wood and a nail, pretending she was building something. She laughed more easily, slept more soundly, and when she took my hand in hers while we walked the fence line, there wasn't that edge of worry in her grip. She was just a child again, and Lord help me, I hadn't thought I'd ever see such a thing under my roof. As for me, I carried my rifle less, though I still kept it close. Habit doesn't break overnight, not after years of war and years more of waiting for trouble. But I didn't sit on the porch with it balanced across my knees anymore. I didn't watch the ridge with my heart clenched like a fist. Instead, I found myself watching them. May, with her sleeves rolled, stirring a pot on the stove, humming low. Lahi curled up by the fire with that battered doll she'd found in the rafters. The sound of their voices in the evening filled the cabin in a way that no weapon ever could. One evening, May stepped out onto the porch where I was smoking. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but there was no fear in her stance, just a stillness that had taken root now that she wasn't running. She looked out toward the barn, her voice steady. "You ever think about how it turned out?" I took the pipe from my mouth, exhaled smoke into the cool air. "Didn't expect it," I admitted. She nodded. "Me neither." Then she turned her eyes on me, sharp and clear. "You glad you stayed?" I thought about that a long moment before answering. "I didn't stay. I stopped running." She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that holds more truth than joy, then turned back to the night sky. We didn't speak again, but we didn't need to. The quiet between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was full. Inside, the cabin changed in ways I hadn't expected. The smell of stew simmering replaced the dry scent of dust and old wood. Curtains May had sewn out of scraps softened the sharpness of the bare windows. My shirts, once worn thin, were patched neatly, the stitches straight and careful. Even the way the chairs sat by the fire felt different, like they belonged to more than one person now. For years, I'd told myself the house was enough, but I hadn't known how empty it truly was until I saw it alive. I found myself noticing the smallest things. The way May brushed hair from her eyes with the back of her wrist when she kneaded bread. The way she leaned her head close to Lahi's when reading from one of my old books, her finger trailing each word slowly so the girl could follow. The way Lahi's laugh filled the cabin and rolled out through the open door, chasing away shadows that had lived in these walls longer than I had. And I noticed something else. Myself. I worked slower, not because of age or wear, but because I wanted to. I wanted to hear the hum of May's voice drifting through the window while I mended a fence. I wanted to catch the sound of Lahi's bare feet running across the yard. I wanted to be here, not just alive, but present. That was new for me. One afternoon, I was fixing the coop door when Lahi came over, wiping dirt on her dress. "Why you help us?" she asked, her voice curious but steady. I leaned on the hammer, looked down at her. "You showed up. Didn't feel right to send you away." "Other folks did," she said, eyes searching mine. I nodded slowly. "Some folks forget what it's like to be hurt." She thought about that, then slipped her small hand into mine, and we finished the walk back to the porch together. Her trust settled heavier on me than any burden I'd carried in the war. At night, when the fire burned low, I lay in bed listening to the sound of their breathing. For years, the silence in this cabin had been a kind of death, a reminder of everything I'd lost. But now, that same silence was alive. It held warmth, safety, belonging. It was the sound of a house becoming a home. I can't say when it happened exactly, when I stopped telling myself they'd only be here for a night, a week, maybe a season. All I know is one evening, as May sat sewing by lamplight and Lahi hummed herself to sleep by the fire, I realized I wasn't counting the days anymore. I wasn't waiting for them to leave. I wasn't bracing for the emptiness to return. They were here, and deep down, I knew they were staying. Spring came slow across Red Bluff, not the kind with sudden bloom and easy warmth, but the kind where the ground fights for every inch, where frost lingers in the mornings, and the sun takes its time loosening the air. I'd lived through 12 springs on this land, most of them slipping past without notice, but this one felt different. I woke one morning, poured my coffee, and stood at the door, watching light spill across the yard, and it struck me plain. It wasn't just me anymore. The porch held 2 extra pairs of boots now, smaller, neater, lined up beside mine like they'd always belonged there. May was already up, sleeves rolled, standing by the stove with her hair tied back. She cracked eggs into a skillet, humming the same tune she'd been humming for weeks now without shame. Lahi sat at the table, her hair wild from sleep, one hand wrapped around a mug of warm milk, the other clutching bread she hadn't touched yet because she was too busy talking. "Do they got a school in town?" she asked, eyes wide, words spilling out faster than she could breathe. I set my cup down. "One-room schoolhouse. Miss Clary runs it." "Do they let girls go?" she pressed. "They do." She turned to her mother, bouncing in her chair. "Mama, can I go? Maybe just the first day if he comes with me." May hesitated, her eyes flicking to mine. I saw the weight of it there, the hope, the fear, the risk of letting her little girl step into the world again. She smiled faintly, soft but sure. "All right," she said. "We'll ask about it next week." Lahi grinned, went back to chewing, and I felt something loosen in my chest. It wasn't just safety anymore. It was possibility. A future, something I hadn't thought about in years. Later that day, we rode into town together. First time since the trouble that May had stepped off this land. She wore her hair up neat, her eyes steady, shoulders squared like she was daring the world to look at her. Lahi sat between us in the cart, clutching a satchel May had stitched from scrap leather, her small face lit with excitement. People in Red Bluff stared a little, but no one said much. The kind of town it was, they'd seen worse and knew better than to ask. We traded eggs for flour, bought a new pair of shoes for Lahi, lamp oil, and a tin of tobacco for me. When Miss Clary leaned down and asked Lahi if she could count to 10, that girl grinned and rattled it off twice just to make sure. May laughed then, not quiet, not guarded, just laughed, and it startled me how much it changed the air. When we got home, the house looked different somehow, not because anything had changed, but because we had brought life back with us. May set about stirring stew, Lahi hummed as she fed the chickens, and I stood on the porch watching them move across the yard like they'd always belonged here. That night, after supper, we sat outside as the sun dipped behind the ridge. The boards creaked under our weight, but none of us moved. Lahi leaned against her mother's side, eyelids heavy, still humming. May looked out across the fields, then turned to me. "You ever think about the way it all turned out?" she asked. I thought for a while, then nodded. "Didn't expect it." "Me neither," she said softly. "But I'm glad." "So am I told her, and I meant it in a way I'd never meant anything before. Later, when I carried Lahi inside and laid her on the cot, she stirred, half asleep. Her small hand reached out, clutching mine. "You're not going nowhere, right?" she mumbled. I squeezed her fingers gently. "I'm right here." When I turned back, May was in the doorway, arms folded. She didn't speak at first, just watched. Then she said, "She believes in you." "She should," I said. Her eyes softened and she stepped closer, laying her head gently against my chest. "So do I." I didn't answer, just wrapped my arms around her, letting the weight of it settle against me. For years I'd carried silence, scars, and nothing else. But now, here in this crooked old cabin, I was carrying something worth keeping, something worth protecting. The lesson came to me clear as firelight. A man can build his life around walls, around silence, around keeping out the world. He can tell himself it's safer that way, easier, less painful. But when the right souls cross his fence line, hungry, hurting, holding on to hope even when it's threadbare, he learns what living really is. It's not in the safety of solitude. It's in the risk of opening the door, of sharing bread, of letting someone close enough to break the quiet. I thought the war had ended me, but it hadn't. It had just left me waiting for them. Now I know this. Belonging isn't something you're given. It's something you choose and something you protect with every breath once it's found. And if you've stayed with me through this story, I want to ask something of you. Don't just carry it quiet. If you felt something in these words, if you've ever known what it means to find a place or a person worth staying for, I'd be grateful if you'd like this video, leave a comment, and follow this channel. Tell me where you're listening from, whether it's a noisy city street or a quiet porch like mine. Maybe you felt the same silence I carried, or maybe you've known the relief of hearing laughter fill a house again. Either way, I'd be glad to know I'm not speaking into the dark, because for the longest time I thought I was a man finished with life. Now I see I was just waiting for May and Lahi, waiting for the day my cabin turned into a home, waiting for the chance to stop running, waiting for the moment when silence wasn't something I carried alone. And that's what I want you to take with you when this story ends, that no matter how long the quiet lasts, no matter how far you think you've gone, belonging can still find you. And when it does, don't let it go.